Hello. Hello. No. Nonsense. Please. Yes, you. I love you. Yes, I see you. I know you. Right. Okay. All right. So, thank you for such a warm welcome back to my basement, where we'll have a fireside chat, I hope. And this will be part 2 in a series that I'm calling Worry Can Be Fun and Easy. So my name is James Clay. I'm a clinical psychologist practicing here in Oregon, and I'd like to continue with the work we did last time. So I hope that you are all continuing to stay safe, and really this is intended, as I said before, for individuals working in direct care facilities or managers that are supporting them, and the worry that we face in these kinds of conditions. So I'm going to try to get this done in one shot. So this is the first shot. It says right here on my cue, it says I'm going to try and get this done on the first shot. This is the blank shot. So I'm just going for it. So let's go together and see if I can get this done in one shot without offending anybody really bad or saying something that is absurd. Let's just see what happens. Stay with me. So I've learned more about using kind of, I guess I need to call them cheap special effects. During the last session, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to see it, but I had some very awkward special effects going on, and this time I plan to be a little bit more on purpose with the special effects. So we'll see if I can do some of the things that I want to today, just for fun. So we'll be on a journey together. See? I hope something happened. Okay. And I should admit here that I can't kid myself. Let's not kid ourselves. I really am doing this because it makes me feel useful. It helps me put my worry towards a better direction. And even if there's just one person that sits out there and says, this is a very odd presenter, I feel like I've done my job. So I really encourage you to enjoy this with me, because I'm going to try to have fun doing this. I don't know if you can do that, try to have fun. I think it's just going to be fun for me. Okay, oh wait, hang on one second. Okay. Oh, well, I hope I can make that work in post. I sound like them from Hollywood there, don't I? I'm going to cut that in post. Okay, so let's follow up from last time. Last time I mentioned that I was growing a COVID beard that was not filled in this part, but was well filled in the rest. And I was doing it so that I wouldn't pick at my beard, which, you know, we're not supposed to be touching our faces very much. And I have just come out of the shower, so I'm doing this. This is okay to do. But it failed for me. I wound up touching my face and touching this kind of stubble up here. So because there's a little bit of stir craziness, and you know, not too many people are judging me at the point for being professional, I have adopted this new beard that doesn't make any sense, and that I'm just going to have to get rid of. But I want to get back to something that was very present and real for me, so that I can use this example as how I responded to it last week, because I'm trying to take my own medicine, and if I offer you an intervention or an idea, I want to use it myself. So last time I talked about this friend of mine who had lived in the basement. and this friend moved out suddenly, and I had wound up focusing a terrific amount of worry and angst into anger at this friend, and it was only because I felt out of control, and my anger towards my friend made me feel in control. So I tried several things this week, which I'll talk about, to try and manage the worry that was left over even after all the other interventions I tried. That's not clear, but hopefully I can clear that up, and I'm not going to go back and start recording again because I was unclear on that point. So let me press ahead here. So this individual, who I respect and like very much, I had focused all this anger on. And I found that I was increasingly worried and getting increasingly angry again. And I'm not exactly sure why. And sometimes I think we can't point to precisely why, other than this is a very unusual situation, and so we may act in an unusual fashion. So excessive worry, even though I had resolved it, came back, and I wound up being very, very, very frustrated with this friend because this friend had left some things in our garage, and it became a real focus of my thinking and effort, like how to get this stuff back to my friend. And I only realized after it was done that I had really done it again. I had over-focused on one person, even though that's absurd. One person to try to control so that I can feel in control. So the things that were really getting to me were, I tried to address them with some techniques that I talked about last time, like writing down worries. In this case, I didn't do that. I'm not sure why, but it didn't feel like that was going to be helpful this time. I did try worrying myself into the worst case with this friend of mine so that I could see that clearly this worst case scenario, which would be terrible, acrimonious fights and just really awful interactions every time we spoke. If I worried about that, I could see with some perspective that that's very, very unlikely to happen. What is more likely to happen is that my friend and I will reconcile after time, and we're very unlikely to have these kind of arguments again. So I did that, and it was helpful. But even with that and meditation and doing things like eating and drinking properly and getting exercise, even with all of that, I still had worry and stress left over, even after all of my friend's things were moved back over to his place. So I practiced radical acceptance, meaning just accept that the leftover worry is here. This is a time of stress. Of course, there's going to be worry. And it was a struggle, but sometimes that did help. Realizing that this is just leftover worry, my brain needs to do it for some reason that I don't have to understand right now. I just have to accept that it's happening, and that this part of my worry is beyond my control, and so I'm not going to torture myself to try to control it. That one was hard to use, but it was probably the most helpful. So I was uneven in following my own advice, but I think I found what was most useful in my own advice, and I really do hope, despite all the goofiness that I have with these presentations, I hope that I can impart something that will be helpful to some. And that's why I'm going to be giving out some other interventions and thoughts today. I want to stress that the use of community. Last time I talked about being isolated was one of the worst things that we could do for ourselves. And having some kind of community contact was always helpful. And I only realized as I was preparing this presentation that I hadn't done a great job with community contact. It was a week where, the friends and I, we didn't really text. I tried a couple times to get a hold of people, but I didn't try very hard. So this is a way that I could have done better as well, and it may have contributed, and in fact it definitely did contribute to my overreaction with worry and anger regarding my friend. So I guess what I'm saying is I followed my own advice to a certain extent and it helped, but I could have done better and hopefully will this upcoming week. And if not, I'll have to look at why I'm not doing better with my own advice. So this time, though, I'd like to introduce kind of an abstract concept. But before I do that, let me do this. Here we go. Okay. All right. So we're gonna talk about a broad topic. Oh, let's do one of these. Hang on a second. Let's do this. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and move on here. We'll be talking about a concept called a naive scientist versus heuristics, right? So if you're not familiar with those terms, we're going to talk about them, and they're going to be pretty obvious. So a naive scientist, that's a way of thinking where a person says, I don't know anything about the world. So everything that I assume is true, I'm going to go look at it and test it to see if it's really true. And you can see no one can actually do that. So we need heuristics, which is, I pretty much know what's going to happen if I push a lamp over. And I know the weight of this plant roughly before I pick it up. So I'm going to assume that that plant is always going to be about that weight, and that if I knock over a lamp, it's going to break. These are shortcuts in thinking. We don't have to prove it every time, or we wouldn't be able to get anything done. We wouldn't be able to drive and talk on the phone or drive at all without heuristics. A good example of what the thinking pattern, right? That's what heuristics is. It's a thinking pattern. A good example is chess masters. They become so familiar with all the possible moves on the board that they can make shortcuts that would take non-chess masters hours to decide one move. So that's heuristics, as opposed to I'm going to examine a point incredibly closely to see if it's correct. Okay, so let's just, these are abstract concepts. Thinking quickly versus thinking deliberately, right? And I'd like to give you an example of, a great example of how heuristics, in this case, they both are valuable, as I've said, but in this case, heuristics cost lives, and I believe cost a tremendous amount of lives. So let's go back to World War I, okay? I'm a history buff, please stay with me. World War I was fought, as most of us know, in the trenches, literally trenches dug for miles and miles and miles, and reinforced trenches on either side in the dirt. And it was fought by men trying to capture the other men's trenches, and back and forth and back and forth. That was the tactic of World War I. So when France learned from World War I that they never wanted to be invaded by Germany ever again, they built a structure that is so massive it's hard to describe. It went along the entire German border with France, which is considerable. And it was a wall. It was enormous, 80 feet tall in many places, with guns protruding from everywhere. It was essentially a permanent trench, right? And the reason that heuristics come into play is because the people who built the Maginot Line and ordered it built were thinking that the tactics from the last war would work in the next war. And that's a very common mistake in warfare, fighting the last war. So what the Germans did to break this very, very, ominous structure was to break it in just a few places. Rather than breaking the structure and rolling their troops over the entire wall, they used new commando tactics, and I could really nerd out on this, but it's new explosives, just new technology, and they breach the wall in 2 or 3 places. And once that happens, the Germans get behind the wall and into France, and the entire wall has to be evacuated, and it's useless. So really, I mean, imagine that you're a soldier, and stay with me, please, although I may be going too far. Imagine you're a French soldier, and you're looking out towards Germany, and you know there have been hostile threats made, and at any point you could see German soldiers or German tanks coming towards the wall, and you were ready to fight. And then there's a retreat. Not because there's an attack against the wall, but because there was an attack against the wall 300 miles away. And now we all have to retreat, or the Germans will capture all of us. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that that happens to a lot of French soldiers on the Maginot Line. And it was one of the contributing factors to the conquering of Europe, was this heuristic. The tactics we used in the last war are the ones that we're going to use in this war, but we're going to put them on steroids, and that will be better. That's a heuristic thought that costs lives, as I've kind of emphasized. You can look for the same mistakes that people might make. Hang on one second. You could look at a whole bunch of other equally damning reasons that a naive scientist approach doesn't work. I think those are pretty obvious, though. Those are, if I start to think too much about the music that I'm playing for experts, then it's harder to play than if I just let it flow. And that would be because if you start to really think hard about the way that you're playing, the natural buildup of understanding in the brain that would go into playing and flowing is interrupted by the frontal lobe saying, let me think about this. So it slows everything else. Whereas if a person is able to, with an expert especially, is able to simply flow, it's quite impressive what will simply come out. And I guess I'm playing a guitar here. So you can see where a naive scientist model may not fit and a heuristics model may not fit. And hopefully you can see where they both do fit at this point. So what I'd like to ask you to do in this next week is to find a belief about COVID that you have that is causing you to worry, and dive into it to see what sources do you have to support that. Let's be a bit of a naive scientist, and I'll try to do this myself. I'm not sure what fact it will be. I'll have to think about it because I assume it's a fact when, of course, it may not be. So I'll dive into that. And I would ask you to do the same thing so that you can start to see that there's only so much that we can act upon that we believe in. And that will lead to changes in worry. If we realize this fact is not one that I can count on. There's too many heuristics about whatever it is. If it happens to be a new medicine that comes on the market and doctors are saying we have no idea if it works, but people are hoarding it, that's an example of a heuristic. And that's also something that we have to say we have no control over what other people are going to do with this. Worrying about it is not useful. It's not leading me anywhere, right? So the naive scientist, when we see those kids on spring break, and hopefully I'm not talking to you kids who went to spring break, but when we see the images of those kids on spring break, we immediately judge and think these kids are everywhere, they're not obeying the curfew. And a more naive scientist role would be to say, I see kids are in my neighborhood and in my town obeying this rule. I don't see those pictures of Palm Beach happening everywhere, but I see them on the news. You can see where this kind of careful thought leads to probably less worry, and also the ability to say, I can't control it, but if I'm going to worry about it, I will accept it. And I hope I'm making sense, because this is kind of the thesis. This is the thesis for how heuristics and naive scientist thinking fit into worry. So as I said before, if there's a specific comment for the one person I have that's watching this, ma'am or sir, if you have a comment or a question, please send them to ORA, post them, and in some way we'll respond so that I can expand on points, or I can tell you why it is that I am the way I am. That's a very frequent question I get. So I'd be happy to tell you that. Well, this is still the first take, and I'm going to have to watch this to see how good I did with managing like silly humor with real content. That is something that I worry about. I do. I just count myself worrying about that. That I want this to be a fun experience for us, but I also want it to be useful. So next time what we'll be doing is talking about control. Why we feel we need it, because there is a deep emotional and logical need for control that we're built in to have. What control that we feel that we have lost, and ways to manage feeling out of control or finding control where we may not have before. Let me give you just a quick example as a bit of a taste for next time. There was a study that found that there was just an obnoxious noise in a factory that would go off every time something happened in the factory, every time there was a breakdown of a piece of equipment. And workers were turning over all the time because they couldn't tolerate this uncontrollable, noxious klaxon sound. And so a psychologist, industrial organization psychologist, suggested putting in a bar where that klaxon could be silenced for 60 seconds. That's it. And what they found was turnover dropped dramatically because the bar gave control over the sound only for 60 seconds. But workers were then able to decide when they could tolerate it and when they couldn't. Giving that small amount of the control changed worker productivity and turnover tremendously. So that's an example of the kind of things that we will be talking about. So be well, be at ease. And let's remember, it takes a big man to cry, but it takes a bigger man to laugh at that man. Enjoy.